Mideast Realities, a unique half-hour highlighting the real Middle East. It is a program of information that government and media often misrepresent or just don't want you to know. Get the news without bias. Facts without distortion. And most importantly, analysis from the experts. With your host and chairman of the Committee on the Middle East, Mertv Svhs Sd. Each week, this program will feature an interview, discussion, or an event to help viewers understand the complex situation in today's Middle East, and especially the realities of U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world. Mideast Realities.
Thank you, Mohammed. Before we begin, I want to just give a couple of quick instructions. First of all, I understand that we did say that there would be a reception following this event, but due to some unforeseen circumstances and Mr. Halliday's busy schedule with the press, there will be no reception, so I apologize for that, especially for those of you who came only for the food. I also want to direct your attention to the various pieces of paper that you have on your seat that you've been given at the front door. In that packet, you have an information sheet that will acquaint you with some of the facts surrounding the continuation of the sanctions regime in Iraq. For those of you who feel compelled to do something to alleviate the crisis among the Iraqi people, there is a form you can fill out that will place you on a mailing list. This list will inform you of various activities like this one in which you can participate. Nancy Gus from Voices in the Wilderness will be able to fill you in on this a little bit more after Mr. Halliday's talk. Finally, the World Conference on Religion and Peace at Harvard has offered you an opportunity to make your voice heard. There is a postcard in your packet addressed to President Clinton. You can fill this out, informing him of your feelings with regard to not only the continuing crippling sanctions in Iraq, but also the current volatile situation in the Gulf region. For those of you who may be unaware, the recent refusal by Iraq to continue with the weapons inspection until economic sanctions are lifted, or until some idea is clarified as to when those sanctions will be lifted, has prompted the President to declare that no options, including military options, are off the table. You can fill out the postcard and leave it with one of the members of WCRP at the door on your way out, and we will be happy to stamp it and send it for you. Just a reminder that a return address must be written on the postcards or they will not be accepted by the White House. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dennis Halliday this evening. Mr. Halliday is a graduate of Trinity College in Dublin and holds an MA in Economics, Geography, and Public Administration. He began his long and distinguished career with the UN in 1964 in development and humanitarian assistance related posts both in New York and overseas, primarily in Southeast Asia. Mr. Halliday's work with the United Nations Development Program took him from Iran to Malaysia to Indonesia to Thailand and back to New York. In 1994, he served as Assistant Secretary General for Human Resources Management of the UN, where he introduced a strategy for better management, performance, and development of some 15,000 UN staff worldwide. In 1997, Secretary General Kofi Annan appointed Mr. Halliday as a UN humanitarian coordinator in Iraq, where he later oversaw the Oil for Food program. In September of this year, Mr. Halliday resigned his post in Iraq, and last month from the United Nations. He is above all a man of integrity, and we are deeply honored that he has joined us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Dennis J. Halliday.
Thank you, Reza. I'm honored to be here in this great university and pleased to be asked to share my thoughts on the impact of United Nations sanctions on the people and on the country of Iraq. I'm very pleased to share these views based on my exposure to Iraq under sanctions over some 13 months, September 97 through October 1998. My agenda here is to raise awareness of the appalling impact sanctions are having on all aspects of Iraqi life, in the hope that some of you present tonight will speak out also, wherever you have the opportunities. And then secondly, to listen to your views on sanctions and alternatives, perhaps to start a dialogue on ways and means of finding alternative ways to impose change other than economic sanctions through the United Nations machinery. By saying that, I'm assuming that you consider it appropriate, like I do, for the world body to have the power and capacity to attempt to bring into line certain leadership, certain governments that are acting outside the bounds of behavior acceptable to the other member states. And let's acknowledge it's very difficult to define exactly what that means. I believe that member states should, even must, try to influence the behavior of erring states. But I also recognize that the difficulty of determining what is acceptable behavior is a real one. It cannot be a Western model. It must be North-South sensitive, and sensitive in other ways: cultural norms, religious influence, colonial past, history, whatever. And yet this must be done without losing sight of some global basic truths as embodied in the United Nations Charter. And that would include human rights violations, humanitarian catastrophes, declarations of war. And that would also include dealing with the sensitive issue of disregarding national sovereignty when human suffering demands an external response. That is, from the outside the country itself, such as humanitarian assistance in cases of natural disaster. But I see the present sanctions regime in Iraq representing a certain bankruptcy of ideas, simplistic, unsuccessful, without the desired results. And I see United Nations sanctions representing unacceptable consequences for the innocent children and people of the country, individuals that certainly had nothing to do with the invasion of Kuwait. There can be no justification, in my view, for the death and malnutrition for which sanctions are responsible. How are they responsible? By denying access to oil sales funds necessary to invest in adequate food intake, a balanced diet, in health care, preventive health care particularly perhaps, the provision of electric power, and in the availability of potable water, the absence of which kills Iraqi children in large numbers. Nothing justifies, under these circumstances, the continuation of sanctions on Iraq by the member states of the United Nations Security Council. And I underline Security Council, with its veto power controlled by 5 members, as opposed to the General Assembly, with full member state representation and equally weighted voting. And this is particularly so when the member states concerned are aware of the appalling consequences for the Iraqi people of their decisions to continue to sustain economic sanctions. And that nothing justifies includes the behavior, attitude, actions, non-compliance, statements, plans, or whatever, of the system of governance in power, the leadership in power. We may not like the government in power, but that dislike cannot be allowed to empower the members of the Security Council to sustain sanctions, a sanctions regime that kills, destroys, and brings to ruin the lives of some 23.5 million people. Modify sanctions? Yes, of course, there will be risks in lifting sanctions now. We may never be absolutely sure what the results might be of the United Nations freeing up Iraqi oil revenues next month, but the risk is likely to be true, equally true, in another 5 or even 10 years. We may never be sure, and we cannot wait, and the people of Iraq cannot wait. And history shows that we can never be sure how sovereign states will behave. History is full of disappointments and dreadful surprises. But we can be sure that sanctions will continue to destroy the people of Iraq if we do not find a compromise, take some risks, separate economic sanctions from disarmament, monitoring, and control of international arms sales. And the issue is, which is better, which is more acceptable? To work with Iraq and seek a better way forward with its people and its government as an integral part of the world community, or to keep Iraq outside the fold without any positive external influence and sustain the damage being done in the name of this country and other countries of the United Nations Security Council. In fact, in the name of the entire United Nations family of nations. Before going further, let me briefly examine for you the kind of damage to which I refer. Those who care in the international community for the children and people of Iraq, as I said, some 23.5 million, have rightly focused throughout the ongoing 8 years of economic sanctions on the high levels of malnutrition and child mortality. Whereas the majority of member states undoubtedly did not intend it to be so, the civilian population, particularly infants and children, are being targeted, are being hit by United Nations sanctions with appalling consequences. The data on infant mortality is known, whereas the World Health Organization may not be in a position to confirm specific numbers. It acknowledges that the monthly death rate of children under 5 attributable to sanctions ranges from 6,000 to 7,000 per month. WHO considers this to be an underestimate, in that births in rural areas of Iraq are often not registered immediately, and that deaths that occur pending registration are in fact never recorded. Now, there are many reasons for this tragic situation of unnecessary death, including the poor health of mothers, the breakdown in health services, generally poor nutritional intake for lack of access to a balanced diet, despite the 986 Oil for Food program, and the high incidence of waterborne disease due to the collapse of the water and sanitation system, plus the electric power to drive it, both crippled by Gulf War missile and bombing damage. The health of mothers over many years of inadequate dietary intake and deprivation have undermined natural immunities that low levels of breastfeeding do not counter, nor is helped by the use of baby formula when mixed with water that is not potable. The provision of basic foodstuffs prior to and now under 986, the Oil for Food program, has not been sufficiently balanced and nutritious to make a significant difference. Within the limited revenues allowed by the Security Council for imports under 986, funds are not adequate for the inclusion in the monthly food basket of animal proteins, meat, fish, chicken, minerals, vitamins, essential in a balanced diet for the well-being of adults and critically important for young children. The 986 food basket has focused on calorific intake via grains, pulses, sugar, tea, and other basic supplies, which taken together with the breakdowns mentioned above, has shattered the life expectancy of Iraqi infants and children. Malnutrition levels for children under 5 years have remained at approximately 30%, despite the input of the government and 986. UNICEF data for the 3 northern governorates, that is where the Kurdish population reside, shows a reduction down to perhaps 25%, still an unacceptably high figure. But as yet, similar improvements in the center and south of Iraq have yet to become evident. In addition, acute and chronic malnutrition is common amongst approximately 10% in terms of acute and some 20% in terms of chronic malnutrition, which, as you may know, leads to stunting, both in terms of physical growth and in terms of mental capacity. The longer-term impact of such damage is frightening. Let me turn to some of the social consequences of sanctions. And by so doing, I in no way wish to divert attention from the malnutrition and the mortality tragedy that I've mentioned. But it is important, nevertheless, to review other forms of damage imposed on the Iraqi people, often unborn prior to and certainly innocent of the events that led to the invasion of Kuwait and the introduction and sustained continuation of sanctions by the Security Council. Not generally reported by the government or the media are the consequences for the social structure and family of the people of Iraq. Continuing sanctions are biting into the fabric of Iraqi society and family behavior. The country has seen significant disruption to the traditional Iraqi family and extended family system. Today one finds many single-parent families, often the mothers struggling alone. There's an increase in levels of divorce brought about by the economic and other stresses that sanctions have imposed. Sales of homes, furniture, and other possessions, books, for example, and homelessness have resulted. Resort to prostitution has developed. Devaluation of the dinar has wiped out the savings and the earnings of professionals and wage earners alike. In 1990, 1 dinar was worth approximately $3, and today it takes 1,500 dinars to purchase $1. You can imagine what this has done to the buying power of normal Iraqi people and what the impact on their families has been. The problem has been particularly felt in Baghdad, where the populace were accustomed to buying imported foodstuffs and other goods. At the same time, inflation has occurred, further exacerbating the difficulties faced by all concerned, leaving in particular those on fixed incomes, such as civil servants, the teaching profession, in very serious difficulties. High costs have placed simple family needs like fresh fruit, meat, fresh vegetables beyond their everyday means. The purchase of imported and luxury items are simply out of the question. Thus, despite the courage, patience, and durability of the Iraqi people, under these circumstances, hopelessness and depression is common. The social impact of 8 years of sanctions are varied and often devastating on the quality of life, standards of traditional behavior, collapse of Islamic family values. Sanctions have severely undermined the expectations of many innocent Iraqi people for the future of their children, and the future of their once proud and prosperous country. Now many must live with the hardship, but even worse for most Iraqis, they must live with the humiliation. One aspect of this humiliation is the begging that is now so prevalent in the streets of Baghdad and other towns, abhorrent to the Iraqi sense of pride and dignity. Another is the growth of corruption, which was largely unknown in Iraq in better times. These phenomena are concerns of the government today and already are concerns for Iraqi sociologists in terms of the future. How will Iraq return to its high moral standards before sanctions disrupted due to the sanctions impact? Perhaps the most conspicuously hit by sanctions, many children have been forced into becoming bread earners, with a drop-out rate from schools of some 20 to 30%. And this in a country where educational standards through tertiary levels have been very high for many years. Not only are many children now expected to work by their parents and contribute to the well-being of the family, but they have been forced into street crime unknown in Baghdad and in other cities. The long-term damage of this will become apparent in the years to come as street children, plus many rural children, grow up with a low expectations and without the benefits of basic education. Unchecked illiteracy rates and other educational deficiencies will increase, thereby having a negative impact on the population and the country's future productivity. These various changes in respect of children within the family have threatened the social order throughout much of Iraq and have weakened the importance normally accorded to the well-being of children within the family and extended family system. Under the economic collapse throughout Iraq today, young adults, freshly trained and graduated, find it extremely difficult to locate employment with newfound skills. Thousands of young people have become idle, whereas they should be actively employed. Unemployment amongst men in particular has become nothing short of a critical problem. Young women have many fewer options than they have enjoyed in recent years. Increased levels of frustration, impatience, anger, boredom are apparent, as is the widespread sense of despair at the situation and in terms of the future in general. The economic hardships place concomitant strains on maintaining social relationships, inability to marry, and within existing marriages, where the basic cost of living has increased many-fold and where a modest standard of life has become impossible to attain or sustain. In lieu of unemployment, thousands more professionals find themselves doing menial jobs that pay more than teaching, civil service, or other appropriate intellectual endeavor. Civil servants, university professors take second jobs driving taxis, for example. Greatly overqualified doctors, engineers end up guarding the United Nations premises in Baghdad. Let me turn to the problem of brain drain. This phenomenon has many consequences, one of which may be the permanent and significant loss of professionals overseas. Whereas the numbers are not fully known, given that many have exited illegally, it is estimated that perhaps some 2 million Iraqi professionals may now be working outside the country. These men and women were the driving force for intellectual endeavor, technological growth and change, for an educational system that has been of an extraordinarily high caliber for many years. They were also relatively high-income breadwinners in a middle class now much diminished. Again, the negative implications may be most acutely felt in the long term, when Iraq's inability or ability to successfully compete in regional and world markets and in scientific pursuits and advancement as a result of this situation may be severely felt. Not only will the departure of much of the country's expertise impede upon Iraq's ability to recover economically and technologically, but their departure has ripped families apart, leaving single-parent inadequacies, and has contributed further to the social damage that sanctions have created. Another negative but lesser-known impact of sanctions has been the severe reduction in the increasingly prominent role that women were beginning to play in the country, where women were making inroads into the workforce. This was significantly boosted during the Iran-Iraq War, when professional, including civil service functions, plus women, police persons and bus driving, for example, became new opportunities for trained women. Due to the economic collapse brought about by sanctions, however, many women have now been obliged to give up their suddenly low-paying civil service jobs in order to work at home at menial but better paid occupations. Their capacity to continue to satisfy middle and senior civil service functions has been undermined by a monthly income level equal to perhaps 1/10 of the price of a pair of shoes. In other words, it has become too expensive to go out and work. Some have continued to serve in the civil service only because their families were able to subsidize their transportation and work-related expenditures. Some have done this in order to stay in touch with the relative sophistication of civil service functions and the possibility of access to ideas and reading material. Those who stay home, like many Iraqis today, are shut off from the news and information about the world outside the borders of the country itself. Other professional women have, however, been obliged to work in sweatshops as part of a family effort to put food on the table.